I hope you had a good 4th of July. This is week 6, and we're going to be spending a fair bit of time on the most important P, which is product. It's kind of the foundation of the 4 Ps. And if one, in fact, does not get the product right, you can have the best pricing strategy, the best promotional strategy, and the best distribution strategy. But without having a good fundamental sound product definition and strategy, you're really probably not going to go anywhere. So I did post already the 4 for this week. There's actually, if I'm not mistaken, 5 different 4 associated with our introduction to the fundamentals of product and product development, and they're open for your posting pleasure. Let's take a look at them here. Yep, so we've got, let's just count them up here. So week 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yep, there they are. No one's posted yet, but they are open and available for you to start engaging. So products can not just be tangible goods, they can also be services or ideas. And there are also the differentiation between business and consumer products. Consumer products drive almost 70% of our GDP or our economy, the other remainder being business products. So we'll spend a little time talking about both of them. One thing about consumer products, there's 4 different types. You can have a convenience product, which is typically a low dollar value, low engagement type of product, a bottle of water, pack of chewing gum, cup of coffee, basic clothes. Shopping products can be something that's it's a bit more complex, and there might be some brand sensitivity to those. Specialty products tend to be cars, homes, college educations, much more substantive kind of product decisions. Then sometimes you have unsought products, which are products that you really maybe not looking for. You kind of go in looking for something and you end up finding out about something else, and those tend to be interesting options as well. Service is actually another type of product. I like this description of the result of applying human or mechanical efforts to people or objects. And what's interesting about services and how they differ from goods are that there are 4 characteristics. They tend to be intangible. For instance, a haircut. You can't really put it on a shelf and pick a box and put it in your shopping cart. You physically typically have to go to a salon or a barbershop. And they're inseparable because there's a number of things that are involved in the haircut. There's the place that you go. There's the people that provide the haircut themselves, hopefully trained clinicians, if you will. And then there's, the products and other, implements and tools they use to provide the service. And usually you can't take one of those away and have it actually still be a service. Then the other thing about a service is, the second you get your haircut, it starts growing again. So it's something that's perishable in nature. And that tends to be a difference between a good and a service, and a good way to describe it. Many times new product developments are like projects. Historically, projects have been serial or push through, where you have an idea and a need, you design it, you buy some stuff to produce it, and then you sell it. What's happening more recently in product development is you get something called concurrent or overlap modeling of development, where you actually start working on a number of different things concurrently over a period of time. And in doing so, you actually end up having a better product at the end to sell, because you get a lot more learning and feedback that goes into it. This slide is a pretty important slide. There's actually a discussion board question on this slide. And what it does is it talks about the influence of what happens in the design phase of a product. And if you think about it, it's in terms of traditional cost, most of the money that goes into bringing a product to market is, the materials and the labor that goes into building it, the factories and the elements that go into supporting that as well. Very little of it, 5% or so, goes into design. But if you don't do well in the design, and this particular slide claims that it has a 70% influence on the total cost at the end, it tends to actually be pretty significant in terms of the impact. Even though it's a small financial impact on the traditional cost, it has a very significant impact on what the end product is. So once you design something, if you don't design it properly, changing it can be very, very expensive. The next slide shows, these are slides that are from companies that I've worked for in the industry to show you that there's a lot of effort and time that's put into the new product or development or the NPD process. And it goes into sort of looking at the impact. A lot of companies, and you can see that concurrent or overlap product development area here. A lot of companies also look at different elements to make sure that they put in quality into their product before it gets released. This feeling flushed is an exercise that I asked you guys to think about. I put up before a question related to that. We'll follow up on that a little bit later. The next slides talk about the different elements of a product. There's product lines, there's product mixes, there's different areas to product lines. So if you think of someone like Campbell's, for instance, you think of them as a soup company, but it turns out that actually Campbell's has a lot of different product lines. They have a sauce line, frozen entrees, beverages, biscuits, and there's a lot of benefits to having a wider product berth. In particular, if you're a soup company, most soup tends to get consumed in the winter or in the colder months, although there is the outlier, which is clam chowder typically, which it gets more highly consumed during the summer months. But that kind of, so if you've got that seasonality where most of your money comes in cold weather, you have these kinds of products to help you generate revenue beyond the cold weather months, and these products get consumed more regularly throughout the year. So that would be one example of the benefit that you get from a broader product mix, if you will. And you always have to look at product lines and whether or not it makes sense to do that or not. And repositioning might be oriented based on changing demographics, declining sales, social environment changes. All these things might cause you to either bring on a product line or end up getting rid of one. Let's see, anything here. Branding is a pretty important concept, and it can be anything between a name, a term, a symbol, design something that's connected to a particular product line, and there's examples of that here. The benefits are that some people do buy brands. This is a slide that looks at the top 10 brands globally. One thing I think that's pretty obvious here is all these companies, top 10 global brands, are United States companies. So that's one sort of thing. There are a lot of tech companies, IBM, Microsoft, Google, GE, Intel, Apple, HP, all significant technology companies. And the other thing that's kind of notable here is that some of these companies are pretty old, but some of them are fairly young. You look at Google, really hasn't been around that long. Intel's a little bit older, Microsoft, HP, IBM's been around for a while. Coke's an old company, relatively speaking. McDonald's, reasonably young, talking about late 50s, early 60s. Disney's similar in there. So some interesting, I guess, common or commonalities or characteristics that are in the particular area of a brand. And a lot of these brands are so powerful that the brand in and of itself will essentially help people make a decision to buy something and become brand loyal and stay with them, despite the fact that there are other maybe less expensive alternatives. And then there's next slides kind of talk about branding strategy, generic. Actually, not having a brand is a strategy, believe it or not. And you look at things like private label brands, manufacturers' brands. So if you go to a CVS, they tend to have their own brand. You go to Walmart, they have their own brand. And usually those products are made by the same companies that make branded products. But since there's a segment or a subset of people who are not going to buy branded products, then what you'll find is that if they figure, well, might as well get some revenue anyways and keep it from someone else getting it, but you don't pollute the brand, right? So you look at Coca-Cola, a lot of the bottling plants that make Coca-Cola, they may make Stop and Shop brand or something else for that matter, and they figure better to make that revenue than to lose it to someone else that might compete against them, without again tarnishing the main brand that you're trying to protect. Okay, we talked about brands here. Co-branding, right? That's where some companies were will cooperate with each other. You look at ingredient branding. You look at there are some sugar-free or low-calorie products that may use NutraSweet as an example. That would be an example of co-branding. Cooperative branding may be, the cooperation between, let's say, a Dunkin' Donuts and a Baskin Robbins, for instance. And complementary branding, Captain Morgan and Coca-Cola, two different sort of brands, but people are going to drink rum and they're going to drink Coke. So you've got that potential combination as well. So those are examples. Trademarks are very valuable. That's something that you own, similar to a patent. It's very significant and potentially beneficial thing to protect your trademark. In addition to, another comment I want to make is about packaging. A lot of times packaging is a way to not just contain and protect a product, but you can also promote it depending on what's on the outside of it, how you label it, what the structure is. All those things have an influence on whether or not people may or may not buy a product. So in addition to having a function, they also can be a promotional element as well. And I think what happens is some people don't understand and appreciate the benefit that a package can actually deliver in helping to promote the product that's contained inside of it. So that can be pretty influential from the promotional process as well. Labeling, as we mentioned, as part of the package can be significant. UPC, Universal Product Codes, are a fixed element in retail. You want to sell a product in retail, you have to have one of these. And there's actually an organization down in New Jersey, Somerville, New Jersey, called the Uniform Code Council that actually administer these. The first product that was labeled with the UPC code and scanned at a register was a pack of Wrigley Spearmint Gum, believe it or not. If you're looking at branding and going globally, those kinds of things are different. A lot of times one brand name everywhere does make sense. Sometimes it doesn't. I'll give you an example. You have a car named Chevy Nova. Nova in Spanish means doesn't go, so the Chevy Nova is branded differently, even though Chevrolet isn't in Mexico. So there's an example of where a brand or a brand name may not necessarily translate depending on what you're doing. So sometimes global packaging, there's issues associated with it as well. There's product warranty issues that are part of a price that goes into a product. A lot of times people don't realize that when you buy something, you're not only paying for the product itself, but maybe some of the warranties and other things that go with it. Minute Clinic is an interesting company. I think when you look at this, and I'll post probably a forum question on this one later. It is an interesting concept that was developed by CVS, and we'll actually leave the Q&A and some of the background behind this for the forum question that I'll post a little later in the week. We talked a little bit about product development and new product development. There's different categories. It could be a totally new product. It could be something that's just repositioned or an add-on or a new and improved kind of version of things. And one of the things I think that's important in new product development is you have to have a strategy. You've got to be able to generate ideas, screen them, do proper financial analysis, then look at developing it, doing some test marketing, then commercializing the product, which is the most expensive portion of this. If you remember the one that showed the casting of the shadow, a lot of the design element happens sort of in here before you get to the commercialization part, and then hopefully you get a new product out of it. And I think the point from this slide is you have a bunch of different products, and typically because of a lot of reasons you only get one or two out, because there's either financial issues, there's product issues, there's manufacturing, there's pricing, there could be market engagement, competitive issues, economic, legal, all kinds of stuff that makes it hard to develop new products successfully. I did post up a forum question on this. Idea generation comes from a lot of different areas. Here's a list of them, and I believe I asked people to pick the top 3. We'll talk a little bit about that online. When you're looking at product development, it's really important to make sure you get opinions from different people. Keep the groups smaller so that they're empowered, and you get rid of hierarchy or structure. Typically, good ideas tend to make it a lot more efficiently if you do it that way. Let people come up with some interesting ideas, and you want to welcome mistakes, but you want to make sure the mistakes that are there are small in control and that you learn from them and that you don't make big mistakes like bringing a big product development to market and not really vetting whether or not it's the right product or not. The next slides talk a little bit about the process of how ideas get done, brainstorming, which you may or may not have been involved in, idea screening, testing of concepts. A lot of time test marketing makes sense. The only issue with test marketing is that when you go to market, you kind of allow both customers and competitors a little peek under the rug. And when you do that, you have to make sure that you do it in a controlled manner and you minimize whatever exposure there would be of what you're trying to do, especially if it's a really new idea to your competition. Business analysis is looking at the financial to make sure that it makes sense to go to market. Development is the important part, creating prototypes, strategy, packaging the product, how to promote, can you make it, and then if there's any legal or financial, legal or political issues, make sure you have those approvals in place before you move forward. Simultaneous product development is another word or another description of the overlap or the concurrent product development. It's the same thing. We talked a little bit about test marketing. Commercialization ends up being the biggest line item. Remember that slide that showed the shadow of new product development? This is where most of the money is spent because you're buying materials, you're putting labor into it. Typically there's a building, equipment, factory to make things. That all costs a lot of money, for sure. Why new products fail? I put up a forum question on this. These are plenty of reasons, but there's typically one that's more significant, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion online about that. We talked about success factors, not too much. Listening to customers always helps. We talked a little bit about the issues with global issues. The next set of slides talks a little bit about how products make it out there and how people adopt them. So this is a process called diffusion. There's 5 different categories: innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards. And a lot of the rate of adoption has to do with how complex the product is, how expensive, how compatible is it with what you have now. Do you have to get rid of your whole investment in order to switch over? A good example of that is when we went from LPs to CDs, and then CDs to MP3 players, most notable being the iPod, and the costs associated with transitioning from one to the other. So all these things have an influence. Is it easy to try? Is it complicated? That all has an impact on rate of adoption. And this shows how typically from a percentage basis new products are diffused into the marketplace. You have the early innovators and early adopters that tend to get it first, and that's what they want to be able to do. And then you have sort of the majority where most people buy it, and then you have people like my parents who are the laggards who don't adopt it until never, in some cases, or way until the end. So this is typically what kind of adoption or process area you have for how people end up adopting products. Again, things that influence adoption is who you are as a person, what the product actually is, and if you're looking from a business perspective, how complicated the buying happens to be. I put up another discussion on this particular slide, and this kind of shows what your product diffusion curve is, adoption curve, and then this shows what happens in terms of, on the y-axis we have product performance, and on the x-axis you have time, and you have this thing called the technology inflection point where you see this line, and it tends to be associated where technology satisfies basic needs. So kind of read this slide, check it out a little bit, and then we have a forum question based on that as well. So, products there's a life cycle for products as we showed here, right? There's also a significant life cycle, and a lot of it has to do with, products do have a limited life. Their sales pass through different stages, and because of that, you promote differently as well. And you have to do that. And profits do rise and fall at different life cycles, and that's shown very nicely here on the sales growth versus profit curve. These are known as S-curves. So here's your typical technology adoption life cycle, and what you see here is the profit curve. And clearly, right, when you're in introduction growth mode, there's going to be a burning of cash because it costs a lot of money to get a product up and running, costs a lot of money to promote it and get the message out there, and hopefully when you get the growth phase, that's when your profit starts to take off. So most new businesses fail, most products fail, and this is one of the reasons why, because people either don't get the product right or have the time or effort or the constitution to be able to tolerate these losses for this period of time. So that's the update for this week. I will send out a separate video overview for the exam, and I'll make sure I'll let you know when that happens. And then, so have fun on the discussion board, and I will try to organize a Skype call as well for those of you who've sent Skype messages so that we can get onto the phone, and, or I shouldn't say onto the phone, onto the internet, and just spend a little time. It won't be more than 15 minutes or so, just kind of asking a couple questions and see where people are with the course so far. All right, speak with you soon, and have a good rest of the week.